Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. This is our weekend edition where we go over a range of different things that happened over the past week that are relevant to you. Do we have a lot to discuss? So we're fortunate today that we have Matt Mackowiak with us to start off the hour. Matt is based in Austin. He sponsors Mac on Politics. That's a podcast sponsored by the Washington Times, right?
That's right. Yep.
And you've got a weekly piece in the Washington Times weekly column. It is a great paper that covers things, especially from a conservative viewpoint. So, Matt, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Merle.
Oh, is this a big week that we have here in the past? You know, used to. At times on the weekend edition, we'd sit back and say, all right, well, here's a couple of things that happened this past week. No more. The question is, can we get it all in these days?
No doubt. It's news hurricane every single week. There's just too much to cover, and this week is no exception.
Well, let's start out with the big decision, or the big legislation in Alabama that is going to apparently challenge Roe v. Wade. Got a lot of coverage from there, a lot of hand-wringing over there. Is Gorsuch and Kavanaugh now going to be prove worth the effort to get them nominated and confirmed for the Senate? Alabama is apparently taking a major step here. They're not just trying to tweak the legislation on abortion. They are actually going head on, trying to challenge things, and apparently try to make this a Supreme Court test. It looks like that's actually in the offing of what they're trying to do, because you have a number of people who are strong pro-life advocates who feel like maybe Alabama's gone too far. Maybe it's not time for that test just yet, but Alabama doesn't take that. So the female governor of Alabama signed the legislation, and now we're going to see what happens. What do you think is going to be, what's going to happen with this?
Yeah, there's a lot to get to. This is the most sweeping pro-life legislation passed by any state. It does outlaw abortion. It's not a heartbeat bill. It's not a born alive bill. Mm-hmm. It's really from the moment of conception, effectively, and it doesn't have the rape and incest exceptions to it.
Which was an issue, because several people said we need to have this aspect in there, and they even lost some supporters because of that.
Yeah, and it does have life of the mother. The life of the mother exception is in there. So, you know, this is, as I said before, the most aggressive pro-life legislation we've seen. I think there are some conservative legal experts who feel that going to that extreme actually makes it harder to ultimately win the case if it were to go to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. We're obviously several years from getting to that point, right? It has to go through several rounds first, and then, of course, the Supreme Court would have to agree to hear the case. But look, I think there are so many different laws that are passing at the state level on the life issue that you are likely to have a Supreme Court ruling that will be important in the next couple of years. You know, Missouri just banned abortion after, I think it was 8 weeks. Mm-hmm. I know at the federal level there are two pieces of legislation that Republicans have authored. The 20-week pain-capable bill that Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, has offered, and then the Born Alive bill that Senator Ben Sasse, Republican of Nebraska, has authored. You know, what's interesting about this Alabama effort is, as you said, it was signed into law by a female governor. It was also authored by a female legislator. Obviously, Alabama's a pretty pro-life state. You have seen some Republican officials come out and say that they think it goes too far. Senator Richard Shelby appeared to make that statement. Senator Doug Jones, the surprise Democrat senator who says he's pro-life, said he thinks it went too far. And even more interestingly, perhaps, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican of California, said he thinks the bill goes too far. He's always supported the exceptions. Let's talk about the exceptions for a minute, because I think it's important. Opponents of the pro-life position make the case if a woman is the victim of incest or rape, she shouldn't be forced to take a baby all the way to term. I think pro-life supporters make the case that it's still a human being.
Yes.
It's not the baby's fault. It's not less of a person. And I know, as we make our way through the world, we come across people who've been born under those circumstances, and they go out and lead wholly productive lives. So it is interesting that Alabama decided to go this far. We'll see kind of where it ultimately goes. It's I will say this: the life issue is going to be a big issue in the 2020 campaign.
I think that's right. I believe Pat Robertson came out saying he thought that might have gone too far, but David French, columnist for National Review, has a piece up. Alabama and Georgia are throwing down the gauntlet against Roe. Good is the title of that. Incidentally, if you're interested in that, you can go to pointofview.net. We actually have that link to that up on the website, so you can take a look at that. But he argues that it's time to have this debate, and that pro-lifers pushed Donald Trump in there. They're one of the big supporters of Donald Trump. He's in there. He's got 2 justices nominated and confirmed, and so they feel like for their votes, David French says it's probably time to have that test, and if it doesn't pass, if the Supreme Court turns it down, fine, then you know where you are. If it does, then the pro-lifers will say that this is, it was worth the vote to try to get Donald Trump in because we've actually made that change. So it's interesting. There are people on both sides of this, and the politics are tough because you've got the Democrats are moving to the left. If this becomes a key issue in 2020, it sort of pulls Republicans to the right if they're going to support it. So we don't know where this is going to go. What do you think the long-term game in this is? Does it play out well, you think?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the abortion issue has been dangerous for Republicans, particularly in competitive races. Remember, Todd Akin in Missouri, Richard Murdoch in Indiana have had trouble talking about the issue in ways that don't make them seem extreme. I'm always reminded of that it's important to make sure people understand that the pro-life position is the compassionate position, in the sense that pro-life supporters don't know the children that are going to be born, don't know the circumstances. The issue of abortion much more directly affects, in a disproportionate way, African Americans and Hispanics far more than it does whites.
Yes.
And so, I think this does give pro-life supporters an opportunity to make the case nationally. One of the things that's encouraging about public opinion is 2 things. One, most people are kind of in the middle on abortion. I think they're probably generally pro-life in the sense that they believe that abortion is a bad decision, but they also believe in things like the exceptions, right, generally. But the second point I was going to make is young people. Science is an interesting thing. Democrats like to pretend like they own science.
Yes, they do,
and they use it as a weapon against Republicans. There's a lot of science though that's advancing the pro-life cause. Right, we've seen this on Heartbeat. We've seen this on I'm forgetting the word I'm looking for, but the ultrasound issue, which Texas has an ultrasound requirement before abortion. I mean, there's so much that's changing in that, and I think our understanding of when life truly begins, when it really begins to become a human being in a way that's not debatable, science is affecting younger people, and younger people are more supportive of the pro-life position than the average person.
It's a very interesting thing because the left wants to say they own science, as you say, but they often deny science. We're going to take a break, and we'll come back with Matt Mackowiak in just a minute, and we'll talk Texas politics. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, shootings in schools and synagogues are always bringing the inevitable question, why? The most recent shootings illustrate that there is no single answer. Although there are some common patterns, there are many different variables. One comprehensive review of 3 decades of school shootings by Tonnell Hobbs did find some common patterns. A significant number of shooters were bullied, were suicidal, told someone, had access to guns, and planned their actions in advance. 10 shared all 5 traits, and 9 more shared 4 of those traits. They did account for slightly more than half of the shooters, but it didn't account for the other half. The mental illness of shooters was also a factor. Public health officials remind us that the vast majority of people with mental disorders are not violent. These medical personnel fear that any attempt to link mass shootings to mental illness will stigmatize such disorders. However, research by Grant Dewey and Michael Rock found that 59% of the public mass shootings that took place in the U.S. were carried out by people who had either been diagnosed with a mental disorder or demonstrated signs of serious mental illness prior to the attack. But that doesn't account for the other 41% whose actions could not be attributed to mental illness. What about the worldview of shooters? Many of them were atheists, but the shooter in the California synagogue came from a Christian home, attended an Orthodox Presbyterian church where his father was an elder. Nevertheless, he was infected with anti-Semitism and white nationalism. This shooting should be a warning to the church that our Christian kids aren't even immune to the violent tendencies in our society. The different aspects of these recent shootings should remind us that there aren't simple solutions to this specter that haunts our land. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And Merrill Matthews, we're back sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me today, Matt Mackowiak. He is the producer of Mac on Politics, sponsored by the Washington Times, has a weekly column in the Washington Times. Mac is Matt's one of the most knowledgeable people on Texas politics, but also national politics. Frequently see him on the news. If you want to know more about him, you can go to pointofview.net. We've got his bio up there and links to his website. So you can check out Matt there. So we are now looking at Texas politics. Texas is wrapping up. The legislature is getting sort of winding down here, we suspect. But it hasn't been nearly the contentious system that it was 2 years ago when so many things were up in the air. And it just seems like the speaker, the lieutenant governor, and the governor all did a group hug and said, let's get along on this one. But they still haven't gotten much done, I don't think, have they?
Yeah, I mean, these legislative sessions always come down to the end. For the listeners that are out there, obviously, Texas has a legislative session that's biennial, so it's every other year for 140 days, and so it's a sprint.
Can we get Congress doing that?
Yeah, it'd be
Probably
nice. Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting because Texas generally views, more laws not as a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's more government, it's more restriction of liberty, and so the fact that they're only there for 140 days every year is a good thing. There's less they can do to you effectively. But in terms of this session, what's interesting is you do have the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker all pretty closely aligned, really from the very beginning, making clear that property tax reform and school finance reform were the two kind of must-haves this session. Everything else was sort of negotiable. or could pass or could not.
And we
so,
really haven't got either yet, have we?
No. Now, the House and Senate have each passed each issue on their own, and they're both in conference committees. And so they're in a good place with, as we sit here, 10 days left or so. It ends the evening of Memorial Day, the 29th, I think, or 27th, excuse me. But the fact that they've each passed their own version in the conference committee means they're just trying to work out the differences. I think the odds that they pass both are pretty high. The controversial element was this idea of a sales tax increase, so-called tax swap, which the Lieutenant Governor and Speaker put on the table about halfway through the session. The idea was to increase the sales tax by 1 penny.
Right.
We have an 8.25% sales tax in Texas, and then to use that money for a larger property tax bill, effectively maybe even getting to a point where they could actually reduce property taxes, not just cut the rate of increase. So that didn't pass. It was kind of dead in the Senate. You had to have Democratic support.
Because as you had pointed out, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker had all said we got to do property tax reform. That's a key aspect. We saw that. We thought there would either be a cap or that there might even be some reduction here. So everybody was on board with this. Then just like 6 weeks ago or so, the governor came out and said, incidentally, we'll try to pay for this with a penny sales tax increase. And I don't follow it as closely as you, but that was the first time I had heard of that.
Yeah.
And I thought, wait a minute. We were all talking about tax stabilization, maybe tax cuts, and all of a sudden we're talking about a tax increase on the sales tax. Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform, came out and hammered that suggestion.
Yeah.
But I that seemed to come out of nowhere as far as I was concerned. Is that the same case with you?
Yes, and obviously putting a controversial idea on the table halfway through a session makes it difficult. I understand why the governor wanted to look at this as an idea. Basically, they've got between $8 and $9 billion in new money to spend this biennium. They're basically spending half of it on property tax, about half of it on school finance. That half of their spending on property tax, as I was saying earlier, doesn't allow them to cut property taxes. It's too expensive. What it does allow is it allows them to put a cap on property tax increases. And so right now we have a 10% rollback rate in Texas, which means if property taxes go over 10% in any jurisdiction, in any city or county, then voters have to approve it. So what do the cities and counties do? They increase taxes every year by 9.99%.
Yes, they do.
That is going to probably, it appears, drop to 3.5%, which is a significant improvement, right? I mean, population increase plus inflation of around 3.5%. That's at a rate where people can stay in their homes, they can afford, they can prepare. 9-10% annual increases, you can't do that. So why the governor wanted to do a sales tax increase? He wanted to try to do a bigger property tax cut bill. In fact, try to even find a way to do a cut. The reason it failed is twofold. One, the Democrats were uniformly against it. They believe sales taxes are more aggressive than property taxes. And you needed 100 votes in order to procedurally move it, and that would have required whatever the number is, 10 or 15 Democratic members of the House to join. And so that was never going to happen. But the real reason it died is that the Legislative Budget Board did an analysis, and it basically said anyone who makes less than $99,000 a year was going to see a net tax increase based on the net of sales tax going up and property taxes going down. So that really killed it, right? I mean, you can't do something just for rich people in that way politically, particularly when you need Democratic support. So that died. So you're going to have a more modest property tax cut bill that'll, I believe, go into law, and then a school finance bill, which would be important too, to put more money in public education.
My concern about it all along was, did you as the governor have in the back of your mind we were going to do this and you just didn't tell us, in which it becomes sort of a bait and switch, or did this come up at the last minute, which seemed unlikely to me? Because if you had campaigned for a year saying we need property tax reform, and incidentally we need to look for a way to pay for this so we can really reduce them, and there may be some things where then I'm fine with that. Even if you disagree with the sales tax, you've at least sort of laid it out there. It struck me that they were selling the property tax cut and then sort of going to hit you with a sales tax increase when it was too far along to actually do something, and that struck me as a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, to answer that question, you'd have to kind of get in his head a little bit, and I don't have the ability to do that at this point. What I would say is, look, a lot of people have been talking about the importance of property tax reform for a long time. it's not unlike in Washington. You talk about the good thing that comes with a policy, but not maybe how you pay for it. So I don't know if he thought the revenue estimate was going to be higher. I don't know if he thought the school finance part was going to be smaller. There are lots of moving pieces. I'll tell you this: I think the biggest mistake they made, and this is getting in the weeds a little bit, is they didn't get the property tax committee chair, Paul Betancourt, who is probably the number one property tax expert in Texas, on board. He should have been consulted and on board at the very beginning.
And he's a good friend with the lieutenant governor.
He is. I mean, he took his state senate seat, succeeded him in the state senate, and very, very close politically. And they were really on opposite sides of this. And so when you have the committee chair in the Senate pouring cold water on it, that was really a bad sign. So look, there's a lot of debate about whether this sales tax increase idea is going to affect the 2020 elections in Texas. I'm not sure it's going to. I mean, to me, it's a much more salient argument to make to voters when someone does something and you can say it was either good or bad for you. To say they tried to do something or they proposed something, didn't even get a vote, didn't get a committee hearing. So, to me, I don't know whether that's going to continue to be an issue unless the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker want to make it an issue. I think what they've realized is you can't do what they want to do long-term on property tax in one session. There just isn't enough money to do it that quickly.
Is there enough money? Somebody like Michael Quinn Sullivan in Power Texans would typically say, we've got enough money in there. If you cut certain other things, we've got enough money to do something like that. Do you think there's some validity in that, or is that overstating it?
Well, I mean, part of it depends on, what level of government, you really think you need. And there's no question that the hardline conservatives, economic conservatives in Texas believe that there's far too much spending now. I mean, look, they're frustrated that they're putting $4 billion into public education. And they would have liked to have seen,
with no demand for reform, is there?
Yeah, very little, if any, reform. No school choice elements, no additional no, increasing the cap on charter schools, nothing along those lines. One little kind of inside baseball thing about that is interesting. Lieutenant Governor is not a huge fan of school districts and sort of their education bureaucracy. And so rather than just sort of give them all the money, he decided, well, what we're going to do is take that $4 billion and do it in $5,000 pay increases for teachers. Basically mandate that that's what happens. And so rather than, again, the sort of education bureaucracy swallowing all that money and spending it however they want, that's what the Senate decided to do. The House put a pay increase in there, but they included all kinds of other staff as well. But they're really letting everyone, the school districts, decide how to spend the money. So that's going to be a big fight that's occurring in the conference committee. We'll see where it ultimately ends up. But I will say this, I mean, to your initial point, I mean, conservatives don't have a lot to show for this session. I mean, we have to be honest about that. Now, again, if they do end up reducing the rollback rate on property taxes to 3.5%, that'll be a very good thing. It'll be a very big victory. That'll be significant. But on a lot of issues that we care about, whether it's the religious freedom bill on Chick-fil-A, which looks like it's dying, we'll see what happens with the election security bill, all kinds of other things. They've been sort of dying on the side of the road the last few weeks.
You mentioned this potential cap on property taxes, which is upsetting the counties and cities because they don't want to go there. So that gets into the issue of where does that authority come from? Is the state prior or is the local control prior? And we'll touch on that when we get back.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And we're back. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And with me today, Matt Mackowiak with Mac on Politics and a columnist for the Washington Times. And right now we're talking about Texas politics. If you want to have a question for Mac, you can call him at 800-351-1212. Our number 800-351-1212, and we'll get you on the air. So, Matt, when we were talking last time, we were talking about the issue of local control. As the legislature was looking at imposing a cap on property taxes, some of the larger cities came up and said, don't do that. We want to be able to raise these taxes. We support local control, they would say. But that has raised a question as to whether or not the state controls things, or is the best, from a conservative standpoint, we tend to say the government closest to the people is the best government.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the states created the federal government. The states create the counties and cities. They're over them. And in many cases, you've got large liberal blue cities that want to do some terrible things out there. And some of the states, including Texas, are beginning to assert their sort of power in saying, no, we're the state are going to stop you from doing some terrible things. What's your position on the local control issue?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it does put conservatives in a little bit of an awkward position for the reasons that you cite. We generally do believe that the government that's closest to the people is the most accountable, the most responsive, and honestly, the closer it is to the people, the smaller that government is,
typically,
right?
Yes.
So presumably, it would be less bureaucratic. The issue is when cities and counties start doing things that literally infringe on your freedom. The primacy of the state takes hold. I mean, I don't think anyone doubts the state's legal jurisdiction and legal justification for preemption laws. We saw, I don't know if that was 2 years ago or 4 years ago, but one of the more recent legislative sessions, they preempted the fracking bans, which the city of Denton put in place. Of course, there is no fracking in the city of Denton, where the University of North Texas is, but the environmental left wanted to go to these college towns, start putting fracking bans in place.
Especially in Texas, because they felt like if we can do it in Texas,
Right.
we can get it done anywhere.
That's right. And, that raises the question, well, do you own your land and do you own your mineral rights or not? Or can the city say, no, you don't own them? So the state decided to preempt them, and that strategy ended. You saw these ridiculous provisions put in place to basically ban Uber and Lyft in some cities.
Yes.
Austin banned
Austin
Uber
won.
and Lyft, for example, and some of the other cities tried to put. Houston, I think, had a ban for a little while that came back in, and so that raised this ridiculous situation where you could take an Uber from a suburb into a city, but not from a city back into a suburb. So the question then becomes, well, is mobility an issue that the state should care about? Or is it simply a local issue? And mobility is an issue. We have highways the state takes care of. We don't let the cities just take care of the highway in the part of their city. Look, this does raise the question on local control. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a perfect answer for it in every situation. What I think you can say is when local governments get beyond what really their charter is, and they start doing things that affect people directly, that limit their freedom, that limit their ability to make money, that limit their mobility, it's entirely appropriate for the state to step in. And I can't think of a better issue for them to step in on than property taxes, where instead of banking the growth dividend the city should be benefiting from, given the massive growth we're seeing in all of our major urban and suburban areas, they've been taking the maximum property tax increase each year right up to the limit. They know that they don't want voters to have the opportunity to vote on what they're doing, so they go right up to the limit, and they grow government. And so valuations are out of control. There's no transparency in the system. Appraisals are ridiculous. The appeal process is totally broken. And you're seeing, people basically having to sell their homes because they can't afford property taxes.
With some of these things, it strikes me as similar to the interstate commerce clause in the federal Constitution, which says that commerce between states is regulated by the federal government because you didn't want certain states doing certain things that affected commerce in other states.
Yeah.
And some of the things that the cities are looking at doing, what I would argue, the Uber and Lyft ban would have been something like that. It affects sort of intercity commerce, inter-county commerce. So it struck me as a perfectly reasonable thing to do on some of those. But since we're talking about local control, in the last session, we had the bathroom bill.
Yeah.
And one of the things the bathroom bill was going to do was going to try to essentially say to at least Ron Simmons, the state rep at the time, was going to say, the cities can't create laws that create a protected class.
Right.
So it was essentially preempting a city from stepping up and saying, we're going to impose a bathroom bill. But there's been really nothing along that this time, is right?
That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think there's a lot of just fundamental misunderstanding about that issue that's out there. And it's an issue that the left tries to use against social conservatives to make them look extreme or out of touch or politically tone deaf or whatever else. The protected class aspect of that Ron Simmons pushed, which I know our friend and colleague Tom Giannetti was involved in, was a really, I think, clever way to approach the issue. It wasn't to say you can or can't use a bathroom or anything else. It was to say you can't single out one class of individuals as it relates to bathrooms. That obviously didn't pass. The left mobilized. They started to get the professional sports involved and Hollywood and all that. Understand this, though. The reason the bathroom bill ever became even an idea is because the Obama administration used an executive order that said, that school districts can do whatever they want on bathroom policy.
Yes, they could.
Right. That is what created this. And so it went from a sort of a theoretical issue to a practical issue. And then in Texas, it went to a totally different level because you had two school districts that announced their policies without consulting their PTAs. I know Dripping Springs outside of Austin was one, and I think the other one was Fort Worth, right?
Yes.
I'm trying to remember which one it was up here in Dallas.
And Lieutenant Governor Patrick came up here to talk to him about that.
That's right. But they just announced their policy without consulting PTA. So imagine you're a parent, and you don't believe that this transgender stuff is something your elementary school or your middle school ought to be involved in, and they're announcing a new policy, and you had no way to be involved in it. So that is why the state tried to step in. The Trump administration rescinded that executive order. So the problem doesn't exist. We haven't had any other school districts push this kind of stuff. And so that's why it's basically a dead issue politically. And that explains it. I know people on the left want to say, well, they lost that fight, the Dems had the upper hand. Well, I don't necessarily disagree on the politics of it, but what I would say is the problem is no longer there because the executive order is no longer there, and that's something that people need to understand.
Yes, indeed. Now, you mentioned Chick-fil-A a minute ago. Where is our Save Chick-fil-A legislation? Is that moving forward, or is that going to die, you think?
Yeah, and this is an interesting issue because the city of San Antonio decided to basically ban Chick-fil-A from the airport. The council member that pushed this initially said it was...
And give us the background. Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A doesn't impose a religious requirement for workers or other things of that nature.
No.
It's just the owners of Chick-fil-A, family-owned, I believe, have given money to conservative groups, conservative religious groups and things.
It's two things. One, they close on Sunday. And they close on Sunday, partly because they have Christian beliefs and they believe Sunday should be a day off. But they also believe it's important for all their employees, many of whom are hourly employees, to have a day off. And so, they give up the revenue they could be making on one of 7 days each week for that reason. But the second thing, and this is what was cited by the San Antonio council member that pushed this, was that, as you said, that some of their leaders had given money personally to conservative organizations. The two they cited, though, are so mainstream, it's unbelievable. It was the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the FCA, and the Salvation Army. If we're going to start banning people to give money to the Salvation Army, millions of people every year give money to the Salvation Army.
Or donate goods and things.
Sure. So,
including me, I've done it.
Sure. Oh, of course. Christmas time, you see the red can there, and the person ringing the bell at the mall. So anyway, what was really ridiculous about the San Antonio action is. Not only was it a bigoted step. Chick-fil-A has never had a problem with the non-discrimination ordinance in the city of San Antonio. They don't discriminate. They've never had a problem. But then they started to say, well, it's not about that. It's about the fact that we want all of our restaurants in the airport to be open all 7 days. As if there aren't any other restaurants, and Chick-fil-A actually makes more money per store. I think they're the fourth largest chain in the country than the top three combined, and that's being closed 1 day a week. That's how profitable they are on an individual store by store basis. So anyway, to get to the point, you did have a legislation that was authored in the House and Senate that basically said that cities and counties cannot punish private businesses for their religious beliefs. The House kind of played some games and didn't move it. The Senate took it up and passed it. The House now is, I think, looking to maybe do something before the deadline. The problem is as we sit here on Friday, I know this program probably airs some over the weekend, next Tuesday is the deadline to pass bills. So if it doesn't pass in the House by next Tuesday, they're not going to be able to do anything. So it's important now, if you're out there listening and if you think religious freedom is important, contact your state House member, your state senator in Texas and let them know that's important to you. It's right on the edge of whether it's going to pass or not.
If it passes, we'll at least get one good thing out of the...
Finally, something conservative,
All right, when we come back, we're going to move to national politics for a minute because we want to talk about Joe Biden, who has jumped in and seems to be taking the lead in things. We'll be back in just a minute.
socialism is disturbingly cool these days. Obviously, we haven't learned enough from history. There are generations of voters who weren't even born yet when the Berlin Wall and Soviet communism fell. They also weren't around in the 60s when many European countries implemented socialist policies that are now a drag on their economies. Author Joshua Muravchik is an expert in foreign policy, especially socialism. He says it's hard to think of another idea that's been tried and failed as many times and in as many ways or at a steeper price in human suffering. Socialism, he says, fails every time it's tried. Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson spoke recently at a Heritage Foundation event about why socialism resonates with younger Americans. He said they are emotionally drawn to the ideals of socialism because they see it as compassionate. He says there's this ignorance of history, especially among young people. What young people know about 20th century history is non-existent, he told the Heritage Gathering, especially about the history of the radical left. Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders says his brand of socialism isn't the kind that's taken hold in Venezuela. Don't count on it. The Wall Street Journal concluded, redistribution of wealth and property is a major theme among the Bernie brigades. In a Salon op-ed in 2013, David Serrata, now a Sanders speechwriter, wrote of constructive lessons to be learned from Chavez's grand experience with redistribution. Senior policy advisor Heather Goutney praised Chavez's programs to redistribute the wealth of the country and his nationalization of private industry. Sanders' National Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray said to achieve racial equality, we need aggressive redistributive policies. Claire Sandberg, National Organization Director for the Sanders campaign, speaking of the United Kingdom's economy, wondered, how do we undo all of the privatization that's occurred over the last 30 years? Their ideas are wrong for America. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And it's Merrill Matthews in for Kirby Anderson today, and we're with Matt Mackowiak of Washington Times columnist and the producer of Mac on Politics, which is sponsored by the Washington Times. We've been talking about Texas politics, but now let's move to federal politics, national politics, Mac. The Joe Biden jumped in the race the other day. We weren't sure if he would do that well. He jumped in, he wanted to be president a couple of times. Back in 1987, he came in, found out that he had been plagiarizing Neil Kinnock, a socialist leader from Great Britain. He stepped out on that, came back in 2008, did not do well. Iowa, I think he left with had like 1%. So it wasn't entirely clear that the public was going to like Joe Biden or want him back this time, but now he seems to be leading in some of the polls, a little over Bernie Sanders. And when they do the matchup between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, he tends to take those. Are we surprised with this, or is this something to be expected given his name recognition?
Yeah, look, he's had a pretty good month. I mean, let's be honest about it. His launch went reasonably well. He raised pretty good money in the first couple days, I think $6 million, which was considerable. He has earned a good number of endorsements, not just from his home state, from all over the place, including in South Carolina, which he's, I think, really trying to set up as the state that he wants to be able to guarantee a victory in.
Mm-hmm.
The really most interesting thing is that Biden's support has grown since he got in. So if it was truly name ID only, it would have stayed pretty flat. But it's really grown. He's taken some vote from Bernie. He's taken some vote from some other people. He's not running a campaign like some of the other candidates are. It's not quite as desperate. He's not doing as many events. Mm-hmm. He's doing less press. And he's trying to really focus on Trump. I mean, he is talking more about Trump and really almost behaving like a general election candidate at this point. Look, there's strong points and weak points to Biden's candidacy. He is clearly not the kind of candidate the Democratic base wants in 2018.
I think that's right.
2019, right? They don't want a white male. They don't want someone that age. They don't want someone who sort of represents the past. Identity matters a lot in the Democratic Party. That said, he does have a lead, and the fact that we now have 23 people running means that the support for all the other candidates is very fractured.
Oh, yeah.
And so he and Bernie are clearly in first and second, and everyone else is kind of trying to figure out how to get traction and get a path to victory. Keep in mind, we're still pretty early. The first televised debate is still like 6 weeks away on MSNBC.
But even there, that's June. We're going to have our first debate. Yeah. We're still 18 months away from the election.
From the general election, that's right. Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, Florida, Super Tuesday moved up.
Yeah.
There's a couple other things about the Democratic race that are interesting. The first is there's a 15% threshold in both Iowa and New Hampshire to get any delegates at all. And so you may have a few people drop out before the end of the year if they're not raising any money or if they're just not getting any traction at all. But you're going to have people drop out right after Iowa and New Hampshire when they get literally zero delegates. They're not going to be able to raise any money and keep going. But the really interesting thing to me about the Democratic Party is their entire primary is proportional delegate allocation. Mm-hmm. So even if you win Iowa and New Hampshire, you're not the nominee. You're not even close to being the nominee. They're not going to have a nominee after Super Tuesday. This thing's probably going to go a while unless really the party unifies behind someone very quickly. And I don't see Bernie's people unifying behind Biden, and I don't see Biden's people unifying behind Bernie. So I do think there's a scenario here where this thing goes on to May or June and perhaps all the way to the convention, particularly with the field as large as it is. If you have 4 or 5 people that have resources in different geographic areas where they can be strong, this thing really could go for a while.
You had mentioned Biden had a pretty good month, and that's not something we can say about Joe Biden that often. He is so gaffe prone.
Yeah.
Is he going to be able to contain that, or can he just not help himself but making gaffes?
Yeah, he can't help himself. I mean, it's the strong side of that coin. The way to look at it is that he's very authentic and very sincere, and the flip side is that he makes a lot of mistakes with that authenticity and that sincerity. It's not that he hasn't had any mistakes so far; it's just they haven't gotten a lot of attention. There's been a lot of news. The president's been doing a lot of things on China trade and other things. But just in the first 10 days or so, he said China's not a threat. Which you're going to see that be an issue. I mean, the president jumped on that right away, and obviously he's going to pick a big fight with China. He already is. That's likely to continue all the way to the election. So that's number one. And then he said all the benefits in the tax law went to rich people. And even the Washington Post fact checker gave that a 4 Pinocchio ruling. That's not the case. Doesn't mean that no rich people benefited, but it certainly wasn't only to rich people. You had every single person that was paying taxes benefited. You doubled the standard deduction. They cut all the rates. I mean, it was considerable tax cuts. So you aren't seeing the focus on the gaffes yet. Maybe they haven't been massive mistakes yet. And honestly, he made mistakes on things that Democrats don't mind him making mistakes on. They don't care that much about China, and they don't care about him saying the tax cut is too good for rich people. It's when he makes a mistake on something else that Democrats do care about. And one thing to watch is there was a story, I think, in the Washington Post this week about how he's going to try to do a more modest climate change proposal, a middle path. And the left really did jump on that. I mean, that's the closest thing he's had to a gaffe so far. They don't want, sort of moderate Democratic politics. They want full-scale progressive politics. You have a Democratic Party base that has a litmus test on some pretty controversial ideas. Yes. Reparations for slavery, Medicare for all, which would end the private insurance industry that 120 to 140 million Americans rely on. The Green New Deal, which is absolutely just ridiculous. It doesn't even pass a laugh test. But serious people are endorsing it.
Free college education.
Free college education. I mean, you go down the list. It's unbelievable. I mean, if you add all these things up, you're talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars.
Yes.
In a country where we have a $4 trillion federal budget and a $22 trillion national debt. So, This is not your father or your grandfather's Democratic Party, even though Joe Biden thinks it either still is or it will be once again.
So that becomes the question. The base of the Democratic Party wants to move left.
Yeah.
I assume there's a fair number of Democrats out there who say, that's going too far. We will lose if we move that far to the left. But is there a critical mass? Can they control the party with their various votes to sort of keep a Joe Biden or somebody a little more moderate? And I'm not sure who's the more moderate person out there. As a presidential candidate, because my sense is if you have a moderate, articulate presidential candidate from the Democratic side, that person could give Donald Trump a real run for the money.
No doubt, and Biden is probably the closest thing to that. I do think fundamentally he's fairly reasonable as a Democrat. I don't think he's extreme. I don't think he would do some of these extreme things that their base is requiring. Biden's strength, I think, is in the general election, potentially. I mean, he really could flip Pennsylvania and potentially Wisconsin and Michigan. He's got kind of an ethos that and an understanding of the middle class that most national Democrats don't have. And if you take those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Trump's total net margin in those states was, I think, 87,000 votes, right? You flip 45,000 and you win those three states. And actually, all the Democrats have to do is flip two of those three. Any two of those three, and they block Trump's path to 270 electoral votes unless he flips another state. So Biden does have potential strength in the general election. Now, that cuts both ways in the sense that I think Trump actually wants to run against Biden because he wants to run against Obama and the Obama record,
right?
Particularly in the economy.
And that is a drag on Biden.
It is. It is, particularly as it compares to what we've seen on the Trump economy. I saw somebody this morning on Twitter saying something about how many jobs Obama created versus Trump, and that Obama's record was a little bit higher than Trump's record. The problem is that a lot of the jobs that Obama created were part-time jobs with Obamacare because of the hour requirement. So there's just really no way to look at the Obama economy and say it was better than the Trump economy. Wages rising, private hiring very high, consumer confidence today I saw was very, very high. So, and that's all with dealing with these uncertainty around trade as well. So imagine how good it would be if we could just put some of this trade stuff behind us. So I think Trump wants to run against Biden. We'll see who they nominate. It's a long way off and very unpredictable Democratic race ahead.
We'll be tired of it by then. Well, we're going to take a break now. When we come back from the top of the hour, we'll be joined by Chelsey Youman, and we'll pick up with the issues then. So stay with us, and we'll be back.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And thank you for joining Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson today as we go over our weekend edition. We've got with us in the studio today Matt Mackowiak. He is the author of, he's a columnist for the Washington Times, and the Washington Times also sponsors his podcast, Mac on Politics. So you should take a listen to that. We have more information about Matt on the Point of View website, pointofview.net. And joining us this hour, Chelsey Youman from First Liberty Institute. And we've got a number of things going on with the Supreme Court this week, so we'll be eager to get to her on talking about that. Thank you for joining us, Chelsey. We've been talking a bit about politics, and now we're going to turn to Attorney General Barr, who has now he mentioned in his testimony and discussions that he feels like there's a problem with things that were going on with Spygate. He's used the term spy. Others have come out and said, that might not be the term I would use, but he has used the term. And now he's appointed somebody to look into this. And Matt, do we know anything about the person he's appointed?
We know he's a U.S. attorney in Connecticut.
Yeah.
Has a good reputation. I think his last name's Durham. Don't know much about his background and career.
Which is probably a good thing. If he's been off the radar screen, he's probably not offending everybody.
That's right, and probably doesn't have a lot of baggage, a lot of enemies at this point. This is pretty close to appointing a special counsel. Mm-hmm. He hasn't really done that, but it's not quite the same. But now he's got one person who's dedicating time to doing this, and I think that's a very good thing. One of the reasons why you've seen this sort of war on Bill Barr over the last few weeks is because he is looking into all these things.
Yes, indeed.
It's not about the Mueller report. They have the Mueller report. They
can go look at it if they want to.
It's been there. No Democratic member's done that. There's a 98% unredacted version available to members of Congress, including the obstruction section, which is 99.5% unredacted. They refuse to go look at it. So it's really not about that. It's about undermining Barr, and they want to raise questions about him so that if he does find wrongdoing as it relates to the origins of the counterintelligence investigation, the FISA warrant process, unmasking, these kinds of things, that they turn him into a partisan actor rather than the Attorney General of the United States. So that's what this is about, and I hope his investigation that this U.S. Attorney conducts on behalf of DOJ is thorough, and if there was wrongdoing, we need to know that, and if there wasn't, we need to know that.
It's interesting because there are two competing scenarios out there. One sponsored by Fox and some conservatives, and the other sponsored by CNN, MSNBC, and others that seem to think this is terrible. The president has obstructed justice. He has worked with Russia and so forth. The Wall Street Journal had an article, and of course, the Wall Street Journal's news section is separate from its editorial section. Its editorial section is conservative. News section, these are just standard reporters. Could have any kind of politics. But they had a sort of a run through of all the things in the news section here a week or so ago, and I read through that and I said, it sounds exactly like the scenario that we're hearing from Fox News and others. I mean, it's touching on the same thing, Steele dossier and so forth. It looks like this is exactly what's happening. And Democrats seem to be in denial on some of these things. I mean, they're denying the Steele dossier was a problem. They're denying collusion from the Clinton campaign It's amazing the two different scenarios you're hearing, and then you hear Adam Schiff and some other Democrats. They're going right forward, feeling like it's time for us to try to press with impeachment or at least get close to it.
I think that's really telling because we know that there are very motivated actors on the left who will not stop and rest until they can discredit our president as much as possible to the fullest extent. I think that the left is looking widely discredited itself now because after years of investigation, the Mueller report turned out nothing. I think the U.S. attorney being appointed, just as a note on his background, he has a stellar, pristine background for doing.
You're talking about Durham.
Durham has a very strong background. He's apolitical. He has been appointed multiple times to conduct these types of investigations by both Democrat and Republican presidents. He investigated some CIA scandal issues before. So he's known for being a hard hitter, no nonsense, apolitical. And I think he's going to be very, very tough to get to the bottom of that. And why it's important, I think, for the American people to understand the reason we'll go back and see how this all came about is because when you're trying to make the case to impeach a president of the United States, it's really important to know when the basis for those allegations are misconstrued, are politically motivated, and that all goes towards President Trump's defense. So.
Do you think Democrats have been pushing this scenario for some time, and they don't want to get off of it? I mean, they're not doing any major issues like infrastructure. They've talked about it. Nothing's moving forward. Immigration reform, nothing's moving forward. Nothing is really moving forward. They have focused almost entirely. Every time you see Adam Schiff and the others, they're talking about this particular issue, it seems like. If Durham is able to find some things in there and starts bringing issues out, are we going to see the Democrats retreat from that and say, let's get back to doing some policy. Let's get some things passed?
I wish. I mean, I would think it would go towards their credibility because, frankly, the country is tired. They are burned out on this. And I think the Democrats' rate of return during election season, it's minimal at this point by continued coverage. I'm going to get my popcorn out and just enjoy the primary because it's shaping up to be ridiculous. I mean, we have real humanitarian crisis across the world. In Yemen, there are 8 million people in danger of starvation. 8 million. That's more than the Holocaust victims. So we have real issues that just frankly aren't getting any airtime, aren't being reported on. And I wish they were. So hopefully the liberal media news outlets will take a hard turn.
Matt, if Democrats don't change their focus, do you think that hurts them in the upcoming election? I mean, there was several weeks ago, they sort of think, well, not only are we going to keep the House, but we could take the Senate, we could expand the House, we could take the presidency. I hear that scaling back a little bit now.
Yeah, I think their fortunes on taking back the Senate have really dimmed. And a big part of that is that they've really failed to recruit first-tier candidates in a lot of the states that they wanted to recruit. In Montana, they've had people run for president, not run for Senate. You've seen that in Montana and a number of other places. So, look, I think it happened in Georgia, it happened in Texas, Montana. They haven't recruited first-tier candidates in Iowa. I could keep going. North Carolina, New Hampshire, Maine. But, look, to your question, when they talk about the Russia issue, they're talking to their base, which is demanding that Trump be removed from office. There's no path to doing that right now. I mean, the Mueller report killed that scenario. If Adam Schiff and Gerald Nadler and people like that can't admit that to themselves, that's fine. But the challenge they have is that Speaker Pelosi has said that she's not going to move forward with impeachment unless there's bipartisan support. And the Mueller report, because of what it found, or maybe more to the point, didn't find, ended any potential for Republicans to break from the president on these impeachment issues. So, it's really interesting. To your point, I mean, the Dems believe one thing, the R's believe something else. The truth is somewhere in the middle, probably. But we want to know, why was the counterintelligence investigation started, and was it appropriately started? What is the deal with the Steele dossier? The Mueller report basically undermined all the findings in the Steele dossier. Was the full picture being given to the court on the FISA warrants being used to spy on Americans? These are huge questions.
And we'll be back to discuss those and more in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, shootings in schools and synagogues are always bringing the inevitable question, why? The most recent shootings illustrate that there is no single answer. Although there are some common patterns, there are many different variables. One comprehensive review of 3 decades of school shootings by Tonnell Hobbs did find some common patterns. A significant number of shooters were bullied, were suicidal, told someone, had access to guns, and planned their actions in advance. 10 shared all 5 traits, and 9 more shared 4 of those traits. They did account for slightly more than half of the shooters, but it didn't account for the other half. The mental illness of shooters was also a factor. Public health officials remind us that the vast majority of people with mental disorders are not violent. These medical personnel fear that any attempt to link mass shootings to mental illness will stigmatize such disorders. However, research by Grant Dewey and Michael Rock found that 59% of the public mass shootings that took place in the U.S. were carried out by people who had either been diagnosed with a mental disorder or demonstrated signs of serious mental illness prior to the attack. But that doesn't account for the other 41% whose actions could not be attributed to mental illness. What about the worldview of shooters? Many of them were atheists, but the shooter in the California synagogue came from a Christian home, attended an Orthodox Presbyterian church where his father was an elder. Nevertheless, he was infected with anti-Semitism and white nationalism. This shooting should be a warning to the church that our Christian kids aren't even immune to the violent tendencies in our society. The different aspects of these recent shootings should remind us that there aren't simple solutions to this specter that haunts our land. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson on Point of View today. We were finishing up this last discussion talking about the 2 different views of what happened with President Trump, Russian collusion or the lack thereof, the Mueller report and so forth. But there's another thing out there in Washington where we're having 2 different views, and that's China. Joe Biden went on here this past week and said, China's not a threat. We're a much larger economy. That's true. He doesn't see China as a threat, and yet increasingly among conservatives and certainly among the Trump White House, they see China as imposing a serious economic threat, a serious political threat, perhaps a military threat at some time in the future with some of the things that China's doing. And at least to me, you certainly can make the case that China has, when Donald Trump talked about other countries imposing tariffs, he was right. And with the World Trade Organization, other countries, our major trading partners, did impose higher tariffs on us than we did on them. He was right about that. And he's decided to use tariffs and others as a way to try to get negotiations and to expand the U.S. economy. China is not just about trade, though. There's other things going on. President Xi is involved in what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're going around and loaning money to other countries to help build infrastructure, harbors, and other things of that nature. There's some concern that China is using that as a way to gain access and support from these other countries. China's been running its military through the South China Sea, building islands out there so that they're beginning to put military defenses on those islands. That has raised questions with Taiwan and some of the other countries there in the South China Sea. And then China has been trying to buddy up with Vladimir Putin and Russia. And there's been a long-running tension of, if China feels like Russia is overstepping its grounds, it comes to the U.S. That happened, which is what started the Henry Kissinger move there in 71, I believe it was, his initial foray in there, and Nixon going there in 72. But now they see us as a challenge, and now they're moving back and working with Russia a little more. So what kind of threat do you think China poses on us?
Yeah, I mean, they're a pretty serious threat. I think there's really no other way to look at it. And the economic threat and the military threat are connected, obviously. I'm not a huge fan of tariffs. I'm a free trade fan, but there's no question that China's trade practices are deeply unfair and have been bad for the United States for decades. And the failure to confront China economically is a bipartisan problem. Past administrations have had almost no success. In fact, they've really made things worse in trying to make things better. And President Trump is just, sort of willing to, if you'll pardon the phrase, break a little China. He's willing to pay a price in the United States economy to try to make China pay a bigger price, try to basically to increase the United States leverage to force China to come to the table. Just in the last couple of weeks, there have been some interesting developments. It sounded like China basically agreed to about 95% of what the United States wanted. And then when the United States said, well, you got to put that in law, they balked. And that's why Trump increased the tariffs, which then China responded to. So it's getting worse right now. It's affecting the economy. We still have a strong economy, and that's part of why the president has a strong hand to play right now. But we need to see this stuff resolved. You're seeing another ag bailout be proposed of about $20 billion, go on top of the $8 billion that was already put in place. It's affecting, obviously, our exports. It's affecting companies that do business in China, Boeing, Caterpillar, Starbucks, you can go down the list. It's not a good thing to have the two largest countries economically in the world fighting at this level. It creates instability. So there's no question China's a huge threat, and President Trump sees that, and he's willing to confront it. Now, again, how long his base will stick with him, particularly the ag sector and the rural areas, that remains to be seen. I don't think this can go on forever, but I think they like that he's going after China, and they trust him right now to keep fighting.
Chelsey, those of us who are older around the table can remember back in Vietnam, China's support for Vietnam. And if you've been from that time, you sort of remember the fact that China was doing some expansionism at the time, expanding communism, trying to move that. But millennials come up, they were after the Vietnam War. Do you think they see China as the threat that some of us older people might see?
I think if they're paying attention, still probably not. So the problem is millennials might not be paying attention to those issues. I don't know that they're particularly passionate about international relations issues. I personally am. I majored in it for a hot minute at Texas A&M University, so I'm very interested. But I do think it's not something to be overlooked. I also, Matt, am a free trade advocate myself, but I do think, and I know that John Smith's principles, you're an economist, so you know that as well. He said there are principled place for tariffs to occur as long as they're temporary. They serve a negotiation tactic and purpose, which I think Trump is very strongly in line with those principled conservative values when it comes to tariffs. I think that we should all remember this is temporary. He's using it as a tool that will hopefully grow our economy in the long run. If he has one thing going for him in his background as a business exec, it is negotiation. And I think that he's really going to be using that skill set here, and he already is with China. Now, the one thing that I think is kind of creating this detente is that China does not want to appear weak to their own people. Right. We know that that's one of their major interests. We have to consider their interests when we're talking about these negotiations. And so if Trump could come off that idea a little bit that it has to be so public to the Chinese people, they might really be able to meet an agreement here. So we'll see. There
was a time in the mid-1800s when the Western powers were trying to trade with China. they began pressing that issue. China was pushing back a little bit. The opium wars come in on that. China goes to war with some of the with Britain and some of the other countries, and the Western powers just defeat China completely in that. It's considered a time of great humiliation, and that sort of mindset still carries over in China today. They were humiliated by the Western powers once, and there's that sort of sense in the background that they don't want to go there again. In some sense, like the Vietnam carries over with us, is we don't want to get into a protracted war that you can't win, that goes on forever, and to help other people in nation build. It just sort of carries into that. Do you think we're gonna resolve these tensions with China?
Resolve them, I don't know. I mean, I think what you might get if the president is at least partially successful is you might get sort of a new relationship, right? That'll enter into a new phase where we're more equal, being treated more equally in a more balanced way. I think what's interesting is China's able to take steps that we're not able to take. They're able to devalue their currency. They obviously don't have a democratic governmental system. But it's also a government and a country really that has to sustain its growth, right? They can't have a 3% economic quarter. They certainly can't have a recession.
And they've already have companies moving out now because the supply chain. Some of these companies are concerned that we're not going to be able to continue this, so they're moving their operations to other places.
No question, that's happening, and I think that has to be figured in. Everyone wants to talk about how a tariff is a tax on the American consumer, and it is. But it's also, moving some of that supply chain to places like India and Vietnam, and that's affecting the Chinese economy as well.
Yeah.
China exports far less to the United States, than we export there. Their economy needs what we offer. They need things like oil, certainly, and other goods. So I think the Trump administration has basically made a calculation. We have a strong economy, and our pain threshold is higher than theirs is. And because of that, we can keep going down this tariff road. We'll put some on, you reciprocate back and forth. At some point, China's going to have to make a calculation that they're going to have to really put something on the table. The problem is that these are not minor accommodations we're asking for. We're basically asking for China to change the way their economy works, to end forced technology transfer, to stop devaluing their currency. There's just so much about the way that they operate that's fundamentally unfair. And so, and not only that, you got to also be able to verify that they're doing what the agreement requires. And that's a huge question mark, too.
Trump seems to put the trade deficit the biggest issue for him, it seems like. Then you've got the state-subsidized government entities where their government funnels money to a lot of businesses so they can keep the prices cheaper. And then there's the technology transfer, the intellectual property issues. From an economist standpoint, I would reverse them. I would put the technology and the intellectual property issue first and the trade deficit last, but that's not what President Trump is doing. And our economy's still holding in strong. The stock market goes up and down quite a bit with these various things that he steps up and does. Well, we're coming up to end of June. Supreme Court's going to be wrapping up, so we're going to come back and start with Chelsey on some of the cases the Supreme Court's looking at and what we can expect to see. Stay with us, and we'll be back in just a minute.
So you sit down and you do your budget, and you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this can make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. That can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The MediShare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They are super friendly. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And we're back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation sitting in today for Kirby Anderson. And with me today, Matt Mackowiak. He is a columnist for the Washington Times and also does a podcast for them called Mac on Politics, and Chelsey Youman. She's been with First Liberty Institute for a good while. What, several years now? 3 or 4 years?
4.5 years.
4.5 years. Graduate of SMU Law School.
That's
And we're speaking of legal issues. We're coming to the end of the Supreme Court term. Next month they'll be wrapping it up there towards. They usually wrap it up right there at the end of June, and those usually save the major cases.
Yes, they
for
make
last.
us wait.
so what cases are we looking at? They decided a few things. What cases are we looking at now?
Well, there's quite a few. Of course, First Liberty Institute, we represent the Bladensburg World War I Memorial Cross, which is out of, obviously, Bladensburg, Maryland. It was a cross erected after World War I. The town had lost quite a few soldiers in World War I, and they did not have graves here on U.S. soil for their dead sons. And so they decided to erect this Latin cross, a 40-foot Latin cross on private property at the time, that bared the names of those who they lost in the town. And it was kind of, as the mothers would say, their U.S. grave site for their sons. And so obviously a significant cross dedicated to honoring our fallen soldiers in battle. Well, of course, the American Humanist Association, those atheists come out in droves. Yes, it's now on publicly owned property, or government property.
Because it was originally privately owned property.
It was originally privately, but then the government took over so they could build some highways, and now it's between the highways.
Right.
And essentially that we made that up to the Supreme Court. Now, I think a few reasons this case is so important. First being that the cross was commanded to be torn down by the circuit court decision, the underlying circuit court decision.
Or didn't it say you could cut the arms off the side?
Right. That was also one suggestion. Let's deface the memorial so that a few atheists aren't offended. The problem being that this is in the same circuit as Arlington National Cemetery. And if you've ever been, there are Stars of David everywhere. There are cross shaped. The cross was the shape. The reason they made this, the memorial, the Latin cross, was significant for the World War I historically. And so there's a lot of historical reverence there. All of those religious emblems in Arlington National Cemetery would now be called into question. So this has significant, on that scale, it has significant repercussions depending on how the Supreme Court ruled. But the other important thing to note is we're essentially asking the Supreme Court to overturn very convoluted test that began in the 70s, and that's the Lemon test for Establishment Clause issues. And that says, basically, if anyone's offended, then you have a right to sue. And it's led to 40 plus years of convoluted jurisprudence. And we think that not only are we going to win after oral arguments that we got to attend earlier this year, but there is a chance that Justice Roberts and Kavanaugh would be on board with overturning the Lemon test, which would really free up to a much clearer, concise test, which would be coercion. Unless the government is forcing you to do something against your beliefs or forcing you to physically worship against your beliefs, really that's what the Establishment Clause, the original understanding of the Establishment Clause was. And so getting back to what our founding fathers knew to be true at the time. So we're looking for that opinion really end of next month. We're very excited. They're writing it right now. So everybody, be praying for the result in that case. That's the big one we're looking for.
So to be clear, the Supreme Court could come up with a narrow ruling, or it could come up with a broader ruling.
Yes.
And you're hoping for the broader ruling, but it could just come up and rule narrowly on this.
Yes, we are really hoping that that the court do away with the Lemon test. It's outdated, and it's led to just a complete mess in the lower courts. And Chief Justice Roberts acknowledged as much during oral arguments. He said, look, if I'm a district court judge looking at the last 40 years of jurisprudence, I'm throwing up my hands not knowing what to do. And I think that's really indicative of the great problems that have come with Establishment Clause jurisprudence. So it would not only resolve with certainty for the American people what their rights and remedies are under the law, but it would also help the judges to be able to more cohesively decide Establishment Clause cases.
Do we have a sense, is this a liberal conservative issue? I mean, the humanists they can be libertarians, they can be liberals, some can be conservatives. Does this going along party lines at all, or are the Republicans and Democrats just simply not weighing in on this?
Well, I don't know. As far as party lines are concerned, that's the clear divide. I know that it's the originalist constitutional, which tend to be on the conservative side, versus those who say, well, times have changed. We would typically qualify Justice Breyer and Ginsburg and some of those justices as the more liberal side of the court, obviously, the block of the court. And their significant concern was, well, doesn't this leave out all of the other religions who were represented in World War I? And we said, well, as far as we know, and the people who erected the cross know, all of those included on the cross were Christian. But even if they weren't, to honor, they could have erected a Star of David to honor the Jewish fallen soldiers, and Christians wouldn't be offended by that. And so they the liberal line seemed to be, well, we're in a diverse society, and therefore Christendom should be hidden from the public sphere.
One of the things that happened, I think, this week is the Supreme Court overturned a precedent, did they not?
Yes, they did.
And
I'm very excited about this.
I saw some of the liberal commentators just sort of reeling back, saying, that means Roe v. Wade is likely to get, or could be overturned because it's precedent also. Is the Lemon test a precedent that they would need to overturn? Is that
Well, that's a good question. Yes, the Lemon test would have to be overturned. Now, the problem with the Lemon test is that it's a lemon. It's been interpreted really different ways, and so they would view it as clearing up their own.
So they may not
test.
see that as overturning a precedent as much as clarifying an issue.
Maybe we'll see. I would say it would be overturning a precedent, which this week I'm really excited about that. By the way, we can only hope that Roe versus Wade is well on its way to being overturned. But they overruled a 40-year-old precedent, and there have been tests before. For instance, Dred Scott was a Supreme Court ruling that had to be overturned by the court itself. And so I think that's significant because there have been times in our nation's history where the Supreme Court frankly made mistakes, bad judgment calls on the Constitution that have led to terrible institutionalized slavery and segregation continuing. And Roe versus Wade is along those lines, but so was the decision they overruled this week, which was more on the lines of it's more procedurally. I don't think people care as much about standing on that. But really, Justice Thomas authored the majority opinion, and he said there are four elements we can look at in overruling a precedent. And that's significant because we've gotten it wrong before. Dred Scott obviously being the big stain on our nation's history. So he said, when a precedent is, especially when it's a constitutional precedent, they said the only way the Supreme Court can be, quote unquote, I guess, overruled when they establish a constitutional precedent is by a constitutional amendment in the legislature. Well, we're never going to have a supermajority to do that. And so really, he said we have to be more highly suspect of our own judgment calls because we have less of a check when it comes to separation of powers on that, constitutionally speaking. And so recognizing what I think is a great way towards recognizing judicial restraint and saying we cannot be an activist court. If we are making these judgment calls that legislatures can't overrule, we have to be more suspect in reviewing those. And then obviously things like if they were made on bad constitutional judgment, if there's poor analysis, which Roe versus Wade undoubtedly is, there's a whole number of factors he's going to consider. And so I think it was good. Justice Roberts and Kavanaugh both signed off on it.
Matt, what's happening, and you saw this in the Gorsuch and the Kavanaugh hearings, is Democrats are so concerned about Roe v. Wade that they seem to be concerned about any effort to overturn some kind of precedent. So it seems like they've almost come to the position that you can't overturn a precedent. That would be terrible, regardless of how bad that precedent might have been. Because in some of the responses I heard from them, sometimes precedent needs to be overturned, and sometimes it's really bad law.
Sure. Yeah, and there's no doubt that the court takes precedent seriously, and they should. But they're also there to rule on matters of constitutional law, and so it's entirely appropriate for them to set new precedent if the circumstances present themselves. Two other things to watch this term are, number one, the constitutionality of asking the citizenship question on the census.
Yes,
is going to be ruled on. That'll be very interesting. It's something we've done basically off and on for the last 150 years. Other countries do it. And then the other is there's a couple of gerrymandering cases. I think in Maryland, I think is one state. Michigan might be the other. That'll affect probably the 2020 elections, at least in those states and perhaps even nationally. Last thing I'll point out is they did rule that a class action lawsuit can be held against Apple related to the iTunes store, and so that's a big issue for Apple going forward, allowing app makers to sue Apple for unfair practices.
When we come back from the break, let's go back to this constitutional issue of asking whether a person is a citizen, because I'm just amazed at how that has become such a key issue here. and liberals have just really taken this issue on, and they're absolutely opposed to it, even though, as you say, we've done it for decades. So we'll be back in just a minute, and with Matt Mackowiak and Chelsey Youman. Stay with us.
Socialism is disturbingly cool these days. Obviously, we haven't learned enough from history. There are generations of voters who weren't even born yet when the Berlin Wall and Soviet communism fell. They also weren't around in the 60s when many European countries implemented socialist policies that are now a drag on their economies. Author Joshua Muravchik is an expert in foreign policy, especially socialism. He says it's hard to think of another idea that's been tried and failed as many times and in as many ways or at a steeper price in human suffering. Socialism, he says, fails every time it's tried. Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson spoke recently at a Heritage Foundation event about why socialism resonates with younger Americans. He said they are emotionally drawn to the ideals of socialism because they see it as compassionate. He says there's this ignorance of history, especially among young people. What young people know about 20th century history is non-existent, he told the Heritage Gathering, especially about the history of the radical left. Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders says his brand of socialism isn't the kind that's taken hold in Venezuela. Don't count on it. The Wall Street Journal concluded, redistribution of wealth and property is a major theme among the Bernie brigades. In a Salon op-ed in 2013, David Serrata, now a Sanders speechwriter, wrote of constructive lessons to be learned from Chavez's grand experience with redistribution. Senior policy advisor Heather Goutney praised Chavez's programs to redistribute the wealth of the country and his nationalization of private industry. Sanders' National Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray said to achieve racial equality, we need aggressive redistributive policies. Claire Sandberg, National Organization Director for the Sanders campaign, speaking of the United Kingdom's economy, wondered, how do we undo all of the privatization that's occurred over the last 30 years? Their ideas are wrong for America. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And with me is Matt Mackowiak of Mac on Politics and Chelsey Youman of First Liberty Institute. And we're talking now about the Supreme Court, and the issue came up about the citizenship because they've still got to decide this. The Trump administration would like to put a question on the general census, the decennial census that they'll be taking next year, about whether or not you're a citizen. As Matt pointed out beforehand, from, if I remember right, something like 1820, 1830, something, maybe 1840, up till about 1950, they had that question on the regular decennial census. Since then, they dropped it then because they thought they might be, there were several other things to ask, but they were trying to keep the census somewhat shorter, but they did ask it in periodic questions they do on a much shorter form that they do during the 10-year spread. So it's been around for a long time, and the president wants to bring that back for several reasons, and I think some of these are compelling reasons. But the Democrats have just really thrown up a fit about this, and so they've had the oral arguments, and we don't know yet where the Supreme Court's going to rule on this. Do you have a sense of that, Matt, at all?
We oftentimes try to sort of read the tea leaves based on questions that the justices ask during the oral arguments. That doesn't always predict
it's not a good predictor.
What their decisions are going to be. No, it's actually not a very good predictor. I guess it's better than nothing, but not much better. So no, I don't think we really do have a sense yet. The question is going to be how they interpret the purpose of the census.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it to find out how many human beings live in a particular area, or is it to find out how many citizens live in a particular area? I mean, it raises the question, does government exist to provide services to non-citizens or not?
Right.
I don't think anyone believes we should not serve non-citizens in emergency rooms, for example, let them die on the side of the road. Of course not. But do we think we should be providing health care and education and you name it, all these other services? There has to be a limit somewhere to the generosity of the taxpayer. And so there certainly are areas of the country that would be disadvantaged if citizenship were included. You could imagine urban areas where there'd be larger, non-citizen populations, and so those areas are oftentimes more democratic. So that's why Democrats are obviously fighting this as hard as they are.
As soon as this issue came up, I published a piece, and I think in thehill.com, on the issue of citizenship and health insurance, because when they come out with the figure of the uninsured, I think it's like 27 million or 28 million that they consider uninsured right now from the Census Bureau, because they cannot ask the question of whether or not you're a citizen. That includes people who are here illegally, and nobody. Well, used to, you didn't think they were actually going to get federal support for that, for buying insurance or something. That's changing now in some of the Democratic presidential candidates' proposals. But they always use that large number to say, we've got this many people uninsured, we need to do something about it. And we would come up and say, well, if you break that down, you've got a certain percentage of them were actually higher income people that just didn't want to buy insurance. Percentage of them were eligible for Medicaid, and they just didn't want to go take the time to go enroll in Medicaid. But roughly 30 or 40% were likely here illegally and would not have been benefited from any of the programs, including the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. They wouldn't have benefited from those. So you're using a larger number that sort of makes the problem look worse than the solution would actually address. So if you just had a good sense of how many people were here illegally, you could have a sense as to, you could take the uninsured number and you would be able to say, we've got this many uninsured, but a good many of this many are here illegally and probably would not be getting any of the benefits from an insurance package that we'd pass anyway. So that's one. Some of it has to do with representation. Does a person who represents a district represent the people who are here illegally? And it changes some of the county. If you there's concerns, I think, among people in California and others. If you take that out, does their representation in California decline because a number of people are there illegally, and would that transfer to somebody else? So, number of big issues here. Chelsey, do you have a sense as to what all this is going to mean for us?
Well, I do think your last point for me is at least the most intriguing point, because the big concern that the left has on the census question being included is that non-citizens will not respond to the census, and then their count, because non-citizens, by the way, are counted towards your electoral representatives. Mm-hmm. So non-citizens, even though they are not voters, do get counted towards how many representatives each state can have. And if non-citizens aren't answering the question or the census,
which is the concern, it's not that they wouldn't. It's that they wouldn't. It's not they wouldn't be counted. It's they might. Well, it's that they might avoid answering the question at all.
Right. Well, if they avoid answering they said the census, then they wouldn't be counted towards the ultimate representative number at the end, which we know would greatly undermine a lot of states, especially those who have, sanctuary cities.
Yes, so it's a big issue. If you want to call and talk to us, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. As we get ready to go to the top of the hour, you can give us a call, and we'll take that. They'll take that call. So, are there any other issues that we're looking at closely that have a major impact, Chelsey?
Well, I think, yes, there's quite a few out there. I know that Matt mentioned earlier the partisan gerrymandering, which I'm sure he could speak to even more eloquently than I could. So, but yeah, I don't know if you want to weigh into that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've had several states had their maps basically redrawn and thrown out just in the last couple election cycles. Pennsylvania and North Carolina come to mind. And obviously, we're heading into a census time period and a new redistricting cycle. So the 2020 election matters a lot.
It matters a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you are generally in a better position to improve your own district if you're there in holding that seat, advocating for yourself.
And it wasn't that long ago that so many states, what was it, something like 2/3 of the states were largely controlled by Republicans in the House and Senate. And that is, I think they've given up some of those gains, but it was a large percentage of the 99 state legislatures that we had. Republicans controlled a large majority of those for a while.
Yeah, the down ballot success Republicans have had over the last 10 years has been really striking. To be honest, a lot of that comes from the gains that were made in 2010 and 2014 and the midterm cycles in the Obama years.
Right.
Obamacare was very unpopular in 2010. Also, to a certain extent, in 2014, and there was a real kind of brushback or backlash, to the Obama agenda. And Republicans gained not just in Congress, not just in the Senate, not just governorships, but down ballot as well. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the court approaches some of these gerrymandering questions going into redistricting year.
So 1-800-351-1212 if you want to call. We'll take that after the hour. When we come back, we'll be talking a bit about the Alabama decision that has gotten so much attention this week. With me today is Matt Mackowiak, who is the sponsor of Mac on Politics. It's actually sponsored by the Washington Times. Matt is also a columnist for the Washington Times, lives in Austin, and is a political consultant, and just knows all things Texas politics and even national politics. And Chelsey Youman is with me. She's with First Liberty Institute. She specializes in these constitutional issues that First Amendment, that First Liberty Institute has been so good at doing and just running. And you've got, 2 or 3 cases coming up in the Supreme Court still?
We've got one, and we're waiting to hear cert grants and a number of other cases.
So it's a close time for us on the Supreme Court, and we hope that ends up going right. So stay with us, 1-800-351-1212 if you want to call. Go to pointofview.net. We've got bios of our guests today, and you can read some of the material that we're talking about today, and we will be back in just a minute.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. Welcome to our last hour of our weekend review, going over the things that happened this past week. With me today is Matt Mackowiak. He's out of Austin. He hosts Mac on Politics, a podcast that's sponsored by the Washington Times, and he's a columnist for the Washington Times. And with me, Chelsey Youman. She's often here on the Millennial program. Now she's here talking about some of the stuff that are happening, especially in the Supreme Court. In the last hour, we finished up talking a bit about the citizenship issue on the census, and we've got a call on that. Luke in Georgia. Luke, you're on the air.
Hey, Merrill, thanks for taking my call. Matt, Chelsey, I appreciate all your comments today, and thank you for educating us in the way you do.
Thank you, Luke.
My comment was that I guess the elephant in the room that people don't acknowledge with this citizenship question is not only are the representatives for each state determined by the census, but directly because of that is the electoral vote, the number of electoral votes each state gets, and there's a direct correlation to that. And as we all know from this last election, that's a huge deal.
It is a very big deal, and the Democrats primarily, I think one of the things they're going to want to push in the in their 2020 Democratic platform is getting rid of the Electoral College. We're certainly hearing that from a number of Democratic presidential candidates.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing really two things happen kind of below the surface. Like you said, number one, you're seeing states decide to basically award their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote.
Yes.
Which, it's kind of an interesting idea, because if you live in one state, you're saying, well, our voters don't matter that much. So let's see what the country thinks, and let's But to Luke's point, if you think about it, what the census question could do is it could basically add real world ramifications to democratic policies like sanctuary cities, right? If they are acting as a magnet for illegal aliens. And those illegal aliens are being accounted for in the census, then they're not going to have as much representation as they would have had otherwise. And that could affect not just electoral votes, but also the formula funding for cities and counties and all kinds of programs. I mean, there would be all kinds of ways that would matter, apportionment for congressional districts, et cetera. So, on the one hand, Democrats want to be for sanctuary cities. On the other hand, they don't want to sort of be held accountable as it relates to the number of citizens versus non-citizens in their geographic areas. It's
a major issue. Thank you, Luke, for giving us a call on that. If I actually did a piece about that for the Tribune News Service here a while back. They do a pro-con, and they have me do these. So they asked the question on the Electoral College, and I took the pro that we want to keep the Electoral College, and so that's available out there on the web. I think if you use Merrill Matthews Electoral College and put in Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, or something like that, it'll pop up because it has become another one of those contentious issues that 2 or 3 years ago I'd have never thought that the Electoral College would have been that big of an issue in a presidential campaign, but it may be this time. So let's turn to the vote in Alabama, the new legislation there. Alabama now has the most restrictive anti-abortion law in the country. Got a lot of attention. We talked about that in the first hour some. Chelsey, what are your thoughts on that legislation?
Well, I have a few. First, being excited that a state was willing to do it. I think that the time is now to be really challenging and pushing forward on pro-life pieces of legislation, simply because of the makeup of our courts since Trump's nomination has changed dramatically. The amount of it's unprecedented the amount of judicial nominations he's been able to get in, which is a huge voting point, by the way, for the base when they came out to vote for Trump. Some, a little bit regretfully, but knowing how important the battle for our courts really was at the time, and that has been completely true. So now with the makeup of the Supreme Court the way it is, I would personally like to see Amy Coney Barrett in the mix. I really think we need one more strong nominee who's a little bit less, maybe hopefully going to, I can't speak to her nomination, but someone we know without a shadow of a doubt that Chief Justice Roberts and perhaps Kavanaugh are more incrementalist in their approach. And so keeping that in mind. But I love seeing Alabama really put their necks out there and do something with their legislative session. The governor signed it into law yesterday. It is the most extreme ban in the country. It is a complete abortion ban. You've probably been hearing about Ohio, Georgia, and Mississippi. They all passed 6-week heartbeat bills, which is essentially when a baby has a heartbeat that is detectable by ultrasound. At that point forward, abortion is no longer an option. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think it's important for our listeners to know that by the time a heartbeat is detected for a child, their likelihood of making it to term and being a live born baby it's extremely high. I think it's like 80% or higher. So there's solid legal reasoning for that. Those are also great measures that are really moving the ball on abortion in our country that shouldn't, get lost with the Alabama. I know ACLU filed a suit in the states of Ohio district courts and a Mississippi district court. So no doubt in the next few years, we'll see this percolating up to the Supreme Court. They say they're actively looking to sue Alabama now. So they're probably searching for their clients, getting their drafts done now.
1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212 if you want to express your point of view. Now, there's been some pushback from very conservative people, pro-life people, who said, this maybe goes a bit too far, but that was actually the intention of the legislation, to push it to as far as they could go. I know
they're reading the tea leaves. Look, Alabama's not in the Fifth Circuit. Mississippi is. So I kind of wish that we could see something in the Fifth Circuit percolate up to the courts, because the Fifth Circuit right now is the most conservative circuit in our country and perhaps the most pro-life circuit that has ever existed in history. So really, I would have liked to see Texas do something on this front, because we really could have gotten a positive ruling, start creating some circuit splits, which the Supreme Court always wants to resolve. So we did have some groups in Texas Alliance for Life and Texas Right to Life were quoted in the Texas Tribune as saying, well, they're the big pro-life lobbying groups in the state of Texas that say, well, an incremental approach is the wisest approach. Well, in my view, we've done incremental for 40 years. So how incremental do we want to be? I think that we have to take a look at the judges we have in place now and know that things are maybe changing.
It's interesting, your point, because as conservative as Texas is and has been, we can't seem to get leading sort of pro-life legislation. Never been able to get school choice done here. We've not been able to do a lot of things you might think a very conservative state would be able to do.
Yes, that is. It's a disappointment this session. We knew going in that it was going to be a very what they called a bread and butter session. So we can talk about that as well. But I wish we'd seen a little bit more on the pro-life side.
Matt, do you think this is going to work for Republicans on the Alabama legislation?
Look, I think it's going to energize pro-life voters, certainly. Let's see what the courts ultimately decide. I mean, look, I think we have to be honest that there's a scenario where this could go against us, not just legally, but politically, perhaps even. Because I do believe that there's, I don't know what the numbers are, you might know them better, but a third or so, or maybe 40% of the country that's pro-life, and a third or 40% that's pro-choice, and there's folks in the middle that are okay with the exceptions, that don't want extreme positions, they don't want babies being aborted once they're born alive, but maybe they want the exceptions. So how do you reach out to those people in the middle?
1-800-351-1212, and we'll be back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, shootings in schools and synagogues are always bringing the inevitable question, why? The most recent shootings illustrate that there is no single answer. Although there are some common patterns, there are many different variables. One comprehensive review of 3 decades of school shootings by Tonnell Hobbs did find some common patterns. A significant number of shooters were bullied, were suicidal, told someone, had access to guns, and planned their actions in advance. 10 shared all 5 traits, and 9 more shared 4 of those traits. They did account for slightly more than half of the shooters, but it didn't account for the other half. The mental illness of shooters was also a factor. Public health officials remind us that the vast majority of people with mental disorders are not violent. These medical personnel fear that any attempt to link mass shootings to mental illness will stigmatize such disorders. However, research by Grant Dewey and Michael Rock found that 59% of the public mass shootings that took place in the U.S. were carried out by people who had either been diagnosed with a mental disorder or demonstrated signs of serious mental illness prior to the attack. But that doesn't account for the other 41% whose actions could not be attributed to mental illness. What about the worldview of shooters? Many of them were atheists, but the shooter in the California synagogue came from a Christian home, attended an Orthodox Presbyterian church where his father was an elder. Nevertheless, he was infected with anti-Semitism and white nationalism. This shooting should be a warning to the church that our Christian kids aren't even immune to the violent tendencies in our society. The different aspects of these recent shootings should remind us that there aren't simple solutions to this specter that haunts our land. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and here with Matt Mackowiak and Chelsey Youman as we're talking about some of the Supreme Court issues right now, and especially Alabama. And Chelsey, we got an online question, and we wanted to read this and just see if we can get an answer for this listener. I recently had a pro-choice friend bring up concerns about the penalties for illegal abortions in Alabama and Georgia with the heartbeat bill. She says men should be eligible for the death penalty along with the women who would be potentially accountable for illegally aborting their babies. And the lady hasn't read the actual bill, but she's wondering what are some of the specifics, what are some of the issues on penalties that are facing it. Now, I think the Alabama bill would punish the doctor, but not the lady.
Right. Yes.
Where are we on the penalties for these things?
Yes, so it's my understanding the Alabama bill is very specific to the doctor. It is a felony. I think it's up to 1 year in prison and a $2,500 fine. And so really it's more medical practitioner issues that would be really affected by that, not the woman. And then the same is true of Georgia. Now, Georgia, I believe Georgia has a steeper penalty. It might be 99 years. I need to look them up. One is a 99-year penalty, which is
a long time.
That's a long time. It's, they're viewing it as the taking of a life. And so with in mind, their typical punishment, punitive side for that, for taking a life. And that's what they're doing, but neither one of which punish the woman. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, some abolish, those who are on the abolishment side, abolitionist side, I should say, their view is the best way to abolish abortion is to penalize the woman. But a lot of the other conservatives, I think the bulk of the movement does not adhere to that because, after all, the goal is to enable and help women who are in a time of need, who are in desperate situations. And you can't do that by, necessarily criminally penalizing them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we were talking earlier about why the pro-life position is the compassionate position. One of the things that you hear the language the Democrats use, the pro-choice community uses, hands off my body, reproductive freedom, those kinds of phrases. I always just kind of try to remind people, like, what about the child? You're not aborting, a clump of cells. You're aborting a child, right? It's why you're going through a medical procedure, a very dangerous medical procedure, and so someone has to speak for the child. Someone has to care for that, child's rights. I think reasonable people. I believe life begins at conception, but I think reasonable people can say, well, maybe life doesn't begin until there's a heartbeat, right? Or maybe even until viability outside the womb. I think those are at least reasonable positions. What's not reasonable is to say, a baby who survives an abortion and is born, can be denied the right to life. That to me is an extreme position. Well, I'll tell you what concerns me about the Alabama bill is I think that people in the middle, while they believe that the born alive issue is a way that Democrats are being too extreme, I think they may look at the Alabama bill and say this is the way Republicans are being too extreme, right? So me personally, and this is maybe where we approach it differently, I'd like to sort of do things that unify the pro-life community and sort of bring people that are right on the edges and bring them in, right? And we try to make the other side, look extreme, because I think they are. I mean, they want abortion on demand anytime, anywhere, any place, for no reason at all. That's an extreme position. That is an incremental approach. There's no question about it. And we'll see if the courts are willing to overturn Roe versus Wade. That would be something that would save lots of lives, lots of minority children. You look at where these abortion facilities are located. They're located in areas where African American and Hispanic people live, not in nice, rich areas where white people live. So it's important to keep some of these things in mind.
So we've discussed that. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to call, 1-800-351-1212. Let's raise another question that Bernie Sanders, who brings up a lot of issues these days, raised here recently, the issue of felons voting. So he was, the issue came up, and he said, well, I think felons in jail should be allowed to vote. It even came up with the marathon, the Boston Marathon bomber, who one of those brothers is still in jail. Would you allow that person to vote? And he said, yes, I believe that person should be allowed to vote. It's a constitutional issue. The Constitution guarantees you the right to vote, and so you should be able to continue to vote even as you are in jail. Now, I've got a piece. We've got it up on pointofview.net, another one of those Tribune news services where we did a pro-con, and I took the position that at least certain felons shouldn't be able to continue voting. But it forced me to go look at what is the situation right now, and there are 2 states that allow felons to vote. One of them is Bernie Sanders' state of Vermont. Apparently, Vermont has always allowed felons to vote. Maine is the other
Vermont.
one.
Yeah.
Now, Bernie says it has never caused a problem in Vermont. I would argue, well, they keep electing you, so it may actually cause a problem. But there are, if I remember the numbers right, there's about 14 states that allow a convicted felon to vote as soon as they walk out of the prison. You walk out, you get your vote back. There's 22 states, I believe it is, that require you to leave prison and finish parole or probation. So you've got to finish those. Texas is in that. And then I think there's 12 states that require something else. So you may have to petition the governor or do something of that nature to get your voting rights returned. I think those may be, in some cases, pretty pro forma petitions, but you do have to petition or do something else. So most of the states will allow the vote to return either after you leave prison or once you finish parole or probation, to allow people in prison to vote. And this has become an issue. You had Kamala Harris come up and say, I think it's something we should probably consider. She got a lot of pushback on that and then said, well, maybe we ought to stay with where we are. But right now it's essentially a state issue. And apparently Bernie would, I guess, make it a federal issue and try to pass legislation federally. The problem that I have with this, he says it's a fundamental right to be able to vote. That may be true, but we lose a lot of rights and freedoms when we deprive somebody else. And the point I made in the column was that you had a man in Texas. We executed somebody on April 24th for the killing of Mr. Byrd, a black man, dragging him behind his truck. that man who did it, John William King, he deprived Byrd of both his right to vote and his right to life. So it seems to me that if you do that, you don't necessarily get to keep your right to vote. What do y'all think about that?
Yeah, I mean, if the question I would ask Bernie Sanders is, if you believe felons have the right to vote, do they have the right to own guns?
Yes.
Right?
Well, that's exactly. Or search and seizure, because
Sure.
the warden can go in your cell anytime and search and take anything out without a warrant.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, the idea of felons voting in prison is absurd. It's probably supported by 5% of the country. It's an extreme position. It's a reckless position for Bernie to take, and even most Democrats in the field have actually distanced themselves from it. Now, if you want to talk about restoring voting rights, once you've paid your debt to society, I think that's a more reasonable issue. There's a faith element, a Christian element, associated with that. You've seen some states look at that. I want to say I think Florida may have done it recently, and some other states have as well. That's a more reasonable position. But the idea of letting felons vote in prison is ridiculous. Look, a felony is a serious crime, right? I would not be in favor of saying people who commit misdemeanors can't vote, right? That would be extreme. Misdemeanors are generally not serious crimes. Felonies are serious crimes. They have serious jail time associated with them. These are the most serious crimes that you can possibly commit: murder, rape, right? Violence against police officers, aggravated assault. You go down the list. And so the question is, what's adequate punishment? And so curtailing your constitutional rights as associated with that, well, if you've been convicted by a jury of your peers, it seems to me to be perfectly appropriate.
Right. I think there's a few other things to note, that felons are ineligible for a whole host of government benefits in general. And so remembering the big picture here is that part of being a member of voting society is abiding by its laws and the structures that are in place. And that's really important to maintaining a civil society, right? And so they also lose the right to, I think, any of the federal aid that's available, food stamps. There's a whole host of things that the government is not going to support. And so that's one viewpoint to keep in mind. And the other thing I will highlight that Matt touched on is that even among Republicans, for our listeners to know, there is a question as to whether restoring them to society includes restoring their right to vote. And so this is something when you're looking at recidivism rates and their ability or statistical likelihood to return to prison and crime, a lot of conservatives are a little bit, there's some tension there as to how we can best eliminate that number.
One of the things that we've seen over the past several years, and this is in part pushed by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I said pushed, I don't mean that pejorative, but conservatives are increasingly looking at the issue of how do we get felons and others back into the society, integrate them back in, re-examining some of the punishments out there, re-examining ways to reform them. That's something liberals have been pushing for some time, but now many conservatives are on board with that, and that may have an impact with that. So Bernie Sanders says that of his positions, most people were opposed to him, but now they've moved over in that direction. We'll see if that happens with felons voting. I don't know if he'll stick with that. But we're talking about issues. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to join the conversation. And we'll be back in just a minute.
So you sit down and you do your budget. And you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to Medishare for your health care. Medishare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this can make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. That can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join Medishare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The Medishare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They are super friendly. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, or 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. We've got some calls coming in. But give us a call if you want to express your point of view. We've been talking about some constitutional issues. Let's now shift off to California, where California has overhauled their sex education guidelines, and they're apparently, according to the AP news story on this, trying to get schools to begin to raise awareness of issues of transgender issues as early as kindergarten, including books that they're recommending and other things for teachers and those to do this. And I looked at this and I just thought, why would you start kindergarten? Now, we have a link to that article up on the Point of View website. If you want to go there, you can see that article and read it. But it's amazing some of the things that they're trying to push. They had a hearing on it recently, had a number of people driving from all over California weighing in on it, being critical of this. But it just seems like, why are we bringing, at the ripe old age of 5 or 6, sex issues and transgender issues? I didn't even know about that. I just knew there were boys and girls, and that was all I knew, and I was fine with that. What's driving this issue of trying to get people more discussing this more, even for our young children? I mean, there was a person in the article that says, can't we just let our kids be kids for a little while?
Well, I obviously agree with that sentiment, but I think this is a larger part of the movement and plan for the LGBT movement and on the left to really integrate these issues, normalize these issues, and educate on these issues at a younger rate. Because if a kindergartner is hearing about this their entire lives, they're now fully, indoctrinated, so to speak, into these issues. And so, of course, they're motivated to do that. But I think it borders on absurd, and we have to ask what is wisdom here? What's appropriate? Some of the content I don't even really want to say on the air that is mentioned. It's obscene. It's pornographic. There are pictures, just things that should not be introduced, even at the high school level. I mean, this is a curriculum that begins in kindergarten, goes all the way up through high school. Teaches LGBT students how to be in an LGBT relationship. Mm-hmm. Just a number of things that I would think 15 and 16-year-olds, heterosexual or otherwise, maybe that kind of exposure isn't appropriate for them. We should be asking in a world that's overly sexualized, what for the preservation of the innocence of our children, why aren't we advocating for that?
I'm reading from the AP article here. The guidance approved Wednesday by the California State Board of Education does not require educators to teach anything. It's designed as a guide for teachers to meet state standards on health education, such as nutrition, physical activity, combating drug and alcohol abuse. But it's the parts about sex that got the most attention during the public hearing on Wednesday. The framework tells teachers that students in kindergarten can identify as transgender and offers tips on how to talk about that, adding, quote, the goal is not to cause confusion about the gender of the child, but to develop an awareness of that other expressions exist, close quote. And I just look at these things and think, can't they just be kids?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's getting to the point where if you want to raise your kids in a safe, environment, or in a Christian environment, in a God-loving environment, I don't know how you live in California. I mean, it's truly it almost gets to the point of child abuse to even stay living in that state. It's so outrageous everything they're doing. I don't understand why there's any type of education related to sex at that age. It makes no sense whatsoever. There's no doubt, as you said, that they're trying to normalize this type of issue, this type of approach. This is another issue where science is on our side, right?
Yeah.
They like to use science on climate change. We like to ignore it on a lot of other issues. And I just fundamentally reject the idea that you can wake up one morning and all of a sudden decide you're a different gender. So the idea that these issues are being introduced to children in elementary school is absolutely ridiculous. And it goes beyond that, though. I mean, you're seeing, children that are in the process of transitioning. I just saw the actress Charlize Theron is raising a child in a what did she call it? Gender neutral, or she's transitioning the child or something. It's just, at what point does it become child abuse, right? You can't, as a child, you aren't responsible for your own actions until you're 18 years old. If you commit a crime as a child, you go into juvenile justice system, and then your record is wiped clean. Do we think children that are that age should be making, lifelong choices? Would we let a child who's 4 or 5 years old get a tattoo? I mean, where do we draw the line? So this stuff is honestly pretty frightening. I generally trust parents to make decisions like this. I hope the school boards were involved in this California decision. I imagine they weren't. So I don't know where this all goes. Politics is downstream from culture, and conservatives are losing the culture. We're losing the culture wars. We really are. We got to take it back.
I often think about this saying, you can kind of measure the integrity of a culture by how they treat their children. And I think we're in a culture where child pornography is a major issue. There's child sex trades. The sex trade right now, by the way, has more individuals enslaved in sex trafficking than in the entire African slave trade combined. Hundreds of years of African slave trade. So when I think of these things, I think that we need to protect our children. Those are unrelated, but at the same time, we're an overly sexualized culture, and I think that we have to do things to protect and guard the young hearts and minds and the innocent. And that's the principled approach in all of these areas: is let's protect and guard our children.
Good. Let's go to Kathy in Georgia. I think she has Kathy, you're on the air.
My name is actually Cassell.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misread it.
That's okay. It's an odd name. It's okay. I was calling in earlier when we were discussing. I'm sorry, when you guys were discussing both sides of the extreme with the abortion decision and the people in the middle and how to get them over. And what I think to myself personally most often is that I myself am pro-choice because we have choices for birth control. We have choices for what kind of a birth control we're going to use. We get to choose if we're going to have sex. We get to choose who we're going to have sex with and when. These are all rights that no one is trying to take away. And to portray women as unintelligent creatures who just lay down willy-nilly, therefore conceive, and move on to have a very dangerous elected procedure that can end their childbearing forever. It's sort of what's been pushed on us since 1970.
So your point is that women are complicit in the decision to do that, and so do you feel like they should bear some of the penalty as well?
Absolutely, to a degree. Now, here's the difference between a doctor and a woman, is that an obstetrician or an OBGYN has to go through years of medical school, and they know what fetal development is. Well, we've been told, especially Generation Xers, that there is no baby there. This is no baby. And there's a lot of women who do not believe that. And when they know the difference, that's when there's accountability. Accountability comes with the knowledge of what you're doing. So should a doctor be punished? Absolutely. Should a woman? That's sort of a blurry line. My point, and it was the broader point, that the issue of choice and individual rights are not being trampled by the reversing Roe v. Wade. That we still have individual rights regarding our reproductive systems that don't involve taking the life of our unborn child.
Okay, let's get an answer from Chelsey.
Well, I think what you raised some very, very interesting and astute points, and that's because I think what the pro-abortion movement has done is they have really they've really made a business, frankly, billions of dollars business and enterprise out of, one, lying to women, and two, failing to disclose an immense amount of information to women. So they do that by saying, they infantilize women by saying, you don't need to know everything medically speaking. They weren't even giving sonograms to women, letting them actually know what's medically going on in the procedure itself, the recovery. They're telling women it's just an in and out procedure. It's a clump of cells. I mean, there's a whole host of lies that have been perpetrated onto women. And it frustrates me to no end because women are capable. And part of really empowering and enabling women is really giving them real choices and letting them understand the choices they're making to the fullest degree. And there have been obviously just so many casualties from the lies that have been perpetuated on the left. I think that gets lost.
Well, thank you, Cathel. When we come back after the break, we've got some others on hold. We've got Diego on hold, and we'll be back with y'all in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Socialism is disturbingly cool these days. Obviously, we haven't learned enough from history. There are generations of voters who weren't even born yet when the Berlin Wall and Soviet communism fell. They also weren't around in the 60s when many European countries implemented socialist policies that are now a drag on their economies. Author Joshua Muravchik is an expert in foreign policy, especially socialism. He says it's hard to think of another idea that's been tried and failed as many times and in as many ways or at a steeper price in human suffering. Socialism, he says, fails every time it's tried. Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson spoke recently at a Heritage Foundation event about why socialism resonates with younger Americans. He said they are emotionally drawn to the ideals of socialism because they see it as compassionate. He says there's this ignorance of history, especially among young people. What young people know about 20th century history is non-existent, he told the Heritage Gathering, especially about the history of the radical left. Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders says his brand of socialism isn't the kind that's taken hold in Venezuela. Don't count on it. The Wall Street Journal concluded, redistribution of wealth and property is a major theme among the Bernie brigades. In a Salon op-ed in 2013, David Serrata, now a Sanders speechwriter, wrote of constructive lessons to be learned from Chavez's grand experience with redistribution. Senior policy advisor Heather Goutney praised Chavez's programs to redistribute the wealth of the country and his nationalization of private industry. Sanders' National Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray said to achieve racial equality, we need aggressive redistributive policies. Claire Sandberg, National Organization Director for the Sanders campaign, speaking of the United Kingdom's economy, wondered, how do we undo all of the privatization that's occurred over the last 30 years? Their ideas are wrong for America. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back for our final segment on Point of View. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson and Mac Mackowiak and Chelsey Youman with me. Let's go to the phones here. We've got Diego on. Diego, you're on the air.
All right. Good afternoon to you guys.
Good afternoon.
I want to make a comment about the sexualization of children in California. I think, they're trying to form fodder for whatever other letters they want to end up adding to the LGBTQ plus agenda they've got going, like Salon.com, they had that individual on there calling himself the virtuous pedophile, I think they couldn't really do it with letting children choose to be gay, because that, automatically meant that they were choosing to have sex with someone of the same sex. They had a lot of pushback on that. So now they've got this social construct of gender identity. And I think, they want to sexualize all these children and prime them up and just have them ready for all the, what they like to call intergenerational relationship-minded individuals. Whatever word they want to hide behind or whatever group they want to hide behind, but there's obviously an agenda there.
Thank you, Diego. Matt, he does raise some questions. We had the issue in Texas of a wrestler who was born a female. She identified as male. She wanted to wrestle with males, but she couldn't because of UIL regulations. But she was taking hormones, which made her significantly stronger than other women in her class, and so she was taking all the victories, all the competition, but yet it just didn't seem fair to some of us.
Yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of perhaps unintended consequences of this kind of approach. If gender's an opinion, then where does it end, right?
It raises so many questions, and I don't know if it was the Olympics board, but they've got a track and field person who is, as I understand, she appears female, but she has some male aspects in her chromosomes that has pushed up her testosterone significantly higher than, because men have typically much higher levels of testosterone. And as I understand it, they're going to require her to take some injections which would lower the testosterone level there, so it makes it a little, even though it would be higher than most women, it would make it a little fairer for her, because you've got the issues of people who are born male saying, I identify as woman, I want to now run track and field, and they're just wiping out the other women who are there because they can't keep up in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the left wants to pretend there's no difference between men and women. They want to sort of break that down, and it's just another reminder there are differences. There are physical differences, there are biological differences, and we can't wish those things away.
Yeah, I think these are just really extreme views, and at the end of the day, our children are not social experiments. Our children are not science experiments. They're not medical experiments. And that sentiment on the left, I mean, that's exactly what they're doing to an entire generation of people. And I think it's devastating, not just to the children who are being pushed into some of these things or affirmed in these things, but the Bible tells us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that he doesn't make mistakes. We're all made in his image, and that image should be protected and affirmed.
Good. All right, let's go to Whitney. She is in Nevada. Whitney? Whitney? Whitey? Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. It's Whitey. I'm sorry. Whitey, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Abortion has been going on for 46 years. On average, 1.5 million abortions done in this country. So you do the math. It's about 69 million. So after 46 years, I will say another 5 million are accounted for. So in other words, let me put these things in proper perspective for the Americans, especially the Christians, pro-life Christians I'm talking about. Now, the country called Australia, there's 33 million. The country called Malaysia has about 33 million. And the country called New Zealand has about 4 million. You add all this up, it's about 70 million, 70. In other words, the abortionist in America has gone to Australia to kill everyone there, including my family members, gone over to Malaysia to kill my family members, everyone in Malaysia and my family members, and went over to New Zealand to kill everyone there, 4 million. So, in other words, to look at it this way, that Australia, Malaysia, and New Zealand, the abortionists has gone over there to annihilate everyone in those three countries.
It's a lot of people. You know, Bill Clinton, when he was running for president, said he wanted to make safe abortion safe, legal, and then he emphasized rare.
Yep.
It is not. We're not doing as many procedures as we did a decade or two ago, but we're still doing a lot of procedures. It is not very rare.
How safe is it for the baby? Huh?
Right.
I mean, come on. I give you a safe right at the fair, at the Ferris wheel, but you're going to die. You're going to safe right, you know?
Yeah.
How safe is it? Ask Bill Clinton, what do you mean by alone, if and if? What is alone? That guy is a joke. He turned the White House into the whorehouse.
Well, thank you so much for your comment. It is a big issue. We've not addressed that now, but we may hear in the Supreme Court sometime here in the near future.
Yeah, I actually do have some numbers to add to what he said. I think that the number is estimated to be around 61 million children have been aborted.
Mm-hmm.
To put that in perspective, there were 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, and I think there were 1 million Rwandans killed in their genocide. And 5 million Chinese lost their lives during the communist regime to famine and a lot of those issues. So really, we're talking about, if you combined all of those horrific events, still 3 times that amount of our children have been killed.
It puts a face on it when you begin adding up the numbers and then comparing that to the size of some other countries out there and how many people you would have lost.
And the CDC just released some statistics this week that say that we had the lowest amount of births this year than there have been.
Yes.
In
below the replacement rate.
Below the replacement rate. And
right.
you know, this is not sustainable. This is a problem for our country.
It is a problem, and when you have a country with a good economy as we have right now, and I think we're 3.6% unemployment rate.
3.2, I think, nationally. Yeah, it's under 3 in a number of states, including Texas.
It's very low, and so you need people out there working, and we're killing a lot of them. We're just not doing it. So we've got to address some of those issues. Or we're not going to be able to stay in competition with China, as we suggested. Matt Mackowiak, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
You're based there in Austin, and you have your Mac on politics. And how often does that podcast come out?
Every week. Yeah, we've done 155 episodes. Just had U.S. Senator Tom Cotton as our most recent guest. 145 episodes, excuse me. And we've had
now you're inflating
lots of great people. Yeah, we've had great people. So you can get iTunes. It's available on Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, all those places.
And when does your column for the Washington Times come out?
It runs every Thursday in print and is online every Wednesday evening. We took all the podcast episodes and all the columns, put them in one place. It's smackonpoliticspodcast.com. It's kind of an archive for everything.
Good. And Chelsey Youman with First Liberty Institute, thank you so much for being with us. You bring that extra voice in there, the person who is expert on the Supreme Court and all those issues we're facing there. My thanks to Steve for manning the phones and to Andrew for manning the control knobs. They've done a great job here. We'll be back next week. A number of more issues coming up here, and I will be here, I think, on Wednesday next week, where we'll be talking Medicare for all while Curry's on vacation. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you here, and for those of you who called, thank you, and we'll be back next week.
So you sit down and you do your budget and you look at all your monthly costs, your bills, your income, and it seems like there's never quite enough. You know what would help? What would really help? Finding $500 a month to help balance things out. And that is the typical savings, $500 a month for a family when you switch to MediShare for your health care. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. No wonder more than 400,000 people are doing this now. And look, whether you're single or married or you have kids, this could make sitting down to do a monthly budget a lot more fun. Just think what you could do with $500 a month. That can cover a car payment or pay back loans or whatever. Join MediShare and go out to dinner to celebrate. Find out more. The MediShare people are so easy to talk to. They can answer any questions. They are super friendly. Call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
Tired of fake news? Support truth. Join Point of View's Truth Team and bring healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.